Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Chris Perry, Executive Director of the First 5 Years Fund, and it's our pleasure to host this webinar to share the results of our latest national public opinion poll on early childhood education. At the First 5 Years Fund, we believe that quality early childhood education is a necessity for today's families, and the federal government should work to ensure more children have access to the quality care and learning that will prepare them for success when they reach school. And a majority of American voters across the spectrum agree. While partisanship and political polarization have become more extreme, effective early childhood development, care, and education is an issue that unites Americans, regardless of party, regardless of whether or not they have children, and regardless of their income. There is an old saying that politicians and advocates have issues, but voters have lives. Finding and paying for high-quality early care and education isn't an issue for voters, it's an existential necessity. Ask voters about it and hear people from all walks of life give a consistent response about the need for action on early childhood education. In fact, 79% of voters, including 80% of Trump voters and 79% of Clinton voters, want Congress and the administration to work together to improve the quality of childcare and preschool and make it more affordable for parents. Voters understand that birth through age 5 is a critical time in a child's development that truly builds the foundation for later success in school and life. As a result, voters support greater federal investment in a wide range of programs and resources, increasing child care tax credits, funding home visiting, continued and increased funding for existing high-quality programs like Head Start, and more. At the end of the day, parents need help. The voters believe they should get it, and policymakers would be wise to act on this issue. 57% of voters say they would have a more favorable opinion of their member of Congress if he or she supported increased funding for quality early learning and care. We're pleased to work with Lori Weigel, a partner with Public Opinion Strategies, and Jay Campbell, Senior Vice President of Hart Research, on this bipartisan national poll. As you'll hear from Lori and Jay, voters overwhelmingly support a range of federal, state, and local partnerships to help working families with the cost of childcare and preschool programs across the country. And you'll hear a very clear message. Now is the time for Congress to act. Young children and their families are depending on them. You can see this deck and all of our polling content at ffyf.org/2017-poll. I will now turn it over to Lori and Jay to share the findings from our poll.
Thank you so much. So we are pleased once again to be able to present some of these survey findings. We spoke to voters throughout the country, in fact, 1,000 voters this year in a more robust sample. And you'll see the methodology on the next slide. So we were just speaking to them last month. It was a representative sample throughout the nation. And we did a number of things in order to ensure the representativeness of that profile, speaking to voters on both cell phones and landlines. And if you could move to the next slide, I'm still seeing the title slide. Thank you. So as with any survey, there will be a margin of error that's, in this case, just over 3%. The reason that you'll hear from two pollsters today is because our firms represent different sides of the political aisle, although we're going to see that this is not a politicized issue. In fact, there is broad bipartisan support among the electorate. So when my firm polls in candidate races, Public Opinion Strategies polls for Republican candidates, and Jay's firm, Hart Research, polls for Democratic candidates. But together, we have worked on both this survey over the years and a number of other issues related to public policy. So just over a month ago, we spoke to voters throughout the country, and here's some of what we heard. On the very next slide, you'll see that one of the things that we asked voters to do once again this year was to tell us how important a range of different issues are as being goals that people might have for our country right now. And we took a number of different issues that have been sort of high on the agenda and very much at the forefront of news coverage over the last few months, especially with this new administration. But you can see, as we've seen often in the past, that education, and specifically early education, really topped the list. We have an overwhelming majority of voters telling us that improving the quality of public education and making sure that our children get a strong start in life through quality early childhood education are extremely or very important. We're not even looking at the people that said these were at least somewhat important, just looking at those more intense responses. In fact, 84%, on par with controlling the cost of healthcare, told us that early childhood education was extremely or very important. It topped things like taxes, federal budget, even securing our borders. It was far, far above that. We have seen that to be a consistent theme over the years, as I mentioned. On the next slide, you can see that over the course of the last 5 years, making sure that our kids get early quality childhood education has been something that voters have told us is extremely or very important consistently. It has never dipped below 4 and 5. That told us it was extremely or very important over the years. So this has been a consistent theme that we have heard from the electorate, and in fact, ranging from really different both economic and political times over the course of our polling. On the next slide, you can see that they're not just talking about any sort of education. They really are being very specific. And so when we use words like quality and early childhood education, that's on purpose. Because even when we talk about childcare, the voters themselves are telling us that that ought to include early learning. We asked respondents to tell us whether they agreed or disagreed that childcare should include early learning that prepares children for success in school and life, and we had overwhelming agreement with that idea. 86% told us that they agreed with that. In fact, 7 in 10, 71%, strongly agreed with that. And that intense response did not vary whether respondents had a child under the age of 18 living in their home or not. It was extraordinarily consistent with what we've seen. There's a reason for that. If you look at the next slide, we have seen over the years that respondents tell us that they believe early childhood education accrues a number of benefits, both in the short term for the children receiving it, as well as even longer term benefits for our nation. So we tested, as we did last year, to make sure that we were seeing, if there was any distinction from 2016. These were all randomized, and respondents were asked to tell us that they think that potential benefit of high-quality early education programs. Does that help a lot, a fair amount, some, very little, or not at all in each of the following areas? So you're seeing the total, the numbers at the end of those bars is the total saying it helped. The intense response helps a lot is inside those bars, both for 2016 and 2017. The most important thing to note is that every single number on this page is within margin of error of what we saw the year before. So whether it was some more short-term benefits like children having academic success in elementary school, or being able to get along and work with other children, or accruing some more long-term benefits, such as having academic success in middle school and high school, or even very long-term, having a larger pool of highly skilled workers in the long term, we saw consistently that more than 2/3 told us that they thought that high-quality early education programs provide a benefit in each of these various areas. So with that, it's not shocking then that we see that people telling us investments in these areas is important. And so on the next slide, we tested a number of different aspects of early childhood education, making it more affordable, helping state and local communities build better preschool services to make them more accessible for low and middle income families, making those early learning programs available for infants and toddlers specifically, or voluntary home visiting and parent education programs. And again, more than 3/4 told us these were either very or somewhat important to them personally, that we have those types of programs in place. And, you know, this is just not something we see on lots of different government investments or different programs around the country. Early childhood education is really unique in that every single aspect of it is something that people say is important. What makes it even more unique is on the next slide. I referenced this earlier. We saw that voters across the political spectrum, while there's some distinction here, we saw overwhelming majorities of Republicans, of independents, and Democrats saying that all of these different types of programs or different aspects of investments are important to make. And in fact, with Republicans, it was 2/3 or higher on all of these. That just doesn't happen every day, being the pollster who talks to Republicans all the time. So we also saw on the next slide that voters perceive a need out there. They are telling us that there is a lack of quality, affordable early childhood programs. We asked them to tell us about how many of the early education programs in their area, so being specific to where they live, but they say are high quality and affordable for lower and middle income families. And just as we saw last year, most are telling us that very few or only some meet that criteria of being high quality and affordable for lower and middle income families. Very, very few, even fewer today than a year ago, are telling us that all or most of those programs meet that criteria. This is not actually driven by income, as we can see on the next slide. Whether voters are in the lower quartile of incomes or the highest quartile of incomes, they are far more likely to tell us that just some or very few meet that definition of being quality and affordable for lower and middle income families. This is also not a partisan issue, as you can see on the next slide. While Democrats are most likely to say that just some or very few are both affordable and affordable, it is most a plurality of Republicans and independents that also agree with that view and place those programs in that category. So again, not driven by politics, not driven by income. On the next slide, I think that's why we see, again, overwhelming agreement from the voters that Congress and the President are currently not paying enough attention to this issue. We had a majority telling us that they felt Congress and the President so far this year have not paid enough attention to this issue. Only 1 in 5 telling us it was the right amount, and very, very few saying too much. What's notable is that there are a few distinctions here. Our youngest millennial voters are the most likely, almost 2/3, saying that Congress and the President are not paying enough attention to this issue. And then voters of color, whether it's African American, Hispanic, or other, are telling us that overwhelmingly saying that not enough attention is being paid to this particular issue. And we also saw, therefore, that voters really do believe that a number of policies are important and are something that they would support if Congress or the President were to propose them. We tested a wide range of different policies, whether it's funding existing programs, programs designed to, or policies designed to expand access, some very specific ones about increasing tax deductions, and expanding state and federal partnerships. I won't read all the language. Of course, these were randomized, so everyone heard them in a different order. But basically, we got very consistently strong responses. 7 in 10 or more indicated support for each one of these. The most intense support we saw was building on programs that already exist, like Head Start, and providing greater funding to those programs, where we had 3 in 5 voters indicate strong support for that, or increasing funding for child care that directly supports greater access for those low and middle income families. We just saw that people thought there was a need in their own area for that, and we saw an intensely positive response to that idea, but even a very strong idea meaning sort of one that I did not think potentially could receive this strong a response, tripling the amount of the existing child and dependent care tax credit. 7 in 10 voters also responded positively to that. These also are ones, even though we were talking about dollars here, even though we were talking about investments, we saw support, whether it was among Trump voters versus Clinton voters. On the next slide, you're going to see there's some distinction, obviously, as there are in those things when we separate out those two groups. But even among Trump voters, 3 and 5 or more indicated support for every single one of these policies, including increasing funding, which was directly called out in the 2 most popular overall. And those also were close to the top of the list for Trump voters. So very strong response there, and you can see it broken out by party on the next slide. Excuse me, where we also saw that voters across the partisan spectrum were indicating support for every single one of these policies. So if you move to the next slide, I'm going to allow Jay to have a few words about some of our other findings.
Thank you, Lori. This is Jay Campbell at Hart Research. And I just, before I go into this slide, I want to emphasize that the previous slide that Lori just showed you, for my money, the previous slide that Lori just showed you and this one that's up in front of you now are 2 of the most important slides in this slide deck and the findings we had. The previous, because it is incredibly easy for people to say, yes, early education is important. Yes, I value education. It's a lot harder to say, I specifically support a policy that, as Lori says, triples a tax credit and that comes out of taxpayers' own pockets, or that there are these specific policies that they're willing to get behind. The fact that across the partisan spectrum, the support for those policies is so high is incredibly important, as is the question that you see before you now. Because it is relatively easy to say in the abstract that you support something or think it's important, we've always included a question such as this one in the first 5 years polling that we've done, wherein we try to push the envelope a little bit and make strong arguments on both sides of the issue so that we can see how voters fall out and if support tends to decrease or to reverse into opposition at some point. So we read all of our respondents these 2 statements, and as you can see, they are both pretty hefty on both sides. On the one side, we talk about it being a good idea because it invests in our future, and that we address the very high cost of quality childcare and preschool. Where on the other side, we say it's a bad idea simply because the country can't afford to do it. We cite specifically a $587 billion federal deficit that could be made even worse. And even with those strong arguments, we find by a 3-to-1 margin, people coming down on the idea that this is in fact a good idea and something we should be doing. And much like the policies themselves, if you go to the next slide, this sentiment is carried across the electorate and across the partisan spectrum, with, not surprisingly, about 9 in 10 Democrats and Clinton voters coming down on the side that this is a good idea, but perhaps somewhat more surprisingly, and in some ways more importantly, a majority of Republicans, a majority of Donald Trump voters, and 2/3 of independents saying that when we give that strong language and even cite deficits, which are a pretty serious concern to voters on the right of the spectrum, that they think this is a good idea. And if you go to the next slide, sort of taking a step back, and this harkens back to, I think, Lori's very first slide, where we listed the range of policy priorities and asked how important people found them to be. Another reflection of the premium that Americans place on education is when we specifically do a head-to-head in some ways and say, which is the greater priority, making sure that there is sufficient funding for needs such as education, or holding the line on taxes and spending. A majority consistently, going back 3-4 years now, say that the greater priority is making sure that that funding for needs such as education is there and does exist. And this is as true, as you go to the next slide, of those who have children as it is for those who do not. And parents, 63% say that taxes or rather that sufficient funding is the greater priority, just slightly above the 6 in 10 people who do not have children who say this. So it's not even that parents who immediately and their families benefit from increased funding for education. It's even those who do not have a child in their household whose households do not see necessarily an immediate benefit from that, who say by a better than 2-to-1 margin that the priority should be on fully funding education rather than holding the line on taxes and spending. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that this also applies not just broadly to education, but specifically when it comes to early education. Again, these are sort of more high level than some of the findings that Lori took us through, but is important context for that sort of strong support you see for the specific policies that we asked people about. 60% say that the country needs to do more when it comes to ensuring kids start school with the knowledge and skills that they need to succeed. Again, no daylight here between those who have children and those who do not. Is sort of an equally high 6 in 10 voters who say that we should be doing more in this area. And then from a political standpoint, if you look on the next slide, this was something that we addressed specifically in this poll in a way that we haven't necessarily done in the past polling that we've done for the First 5 Years Fund. But we asked, you can see the text of the question at the very bottom of the slide, whether respondents think that their member of Congress should or should not work with President Trump and his administration to improve the quality of childcare and preschool and make it more affordable for parents. You get a fairly lopsided answer here. 79% say that their member of Congress should work with the president and his administration, only 14% saying that they should not. And 79% is such a big number that when you break it out by party, as we do on the next slide, it's virtually a guarantee to be an idea that is shared across the partisan spectrum. 79% of Republicans, 79% of Democrats, and 77% of independents want their member of Congress to work with the president on this. And the reason we asked this question was there is a narrative out there that rank and file Democratic voters don't want their representative in Congress to work with Trump on anything, that they don't want to give Trump any quote unquote political wins. And, on some issues, that's going to be true. The issues that where Democrats disagree with the president, they're absolutely going to want to push back. But it's simply not true that this is a blanket statement we can make. And I think what we've proven here is that if the policy is one that Americans support, as they do in very large numbers, support funding for quality and access to good early childhood education, they're not going to put political gamesmanship before good policy. And so I think this is another one of those really important and interesting findings that come out of this survey that set the conventional wisdom a little bit on its head. And on the same story we have on the next slide, when we break the data out by how people voted last year in the presidential election, whether they voted for President Trump or they voted for Hillary Clinton, 8 out of 10 say that they want their member of Congress to work with the president on this policy specifically. Having said that, on the next slide is something that both Congress and the president must bear in mind as they move forward, and that is there's virtually no one that wants to see funding for early childhood education decreased. 52% say, kind of in an abstract and non-specific question, do you want federal funding for quality early childhood education from birth to age 5 to be increased, decreased, or kept the same? 52% say increased, compared to just 10% who say decreased. 1/3 say that they think it should be kept about the same. So any attempts as budgeting goes forward to make cuts in this area is not going to be especially well received by the American public. And in point of fact, a majority of them would much prefer and would like to see that funding actually increased. And speaking of education priorities in general. On the next slide, we did have another question where we asked people if it would be better to invest more in early education, in college education, or whether investments in those areas should be made equally. And we had a little bit more verbiage behind early education and college education in the question, as you can see there. A majority say that they should be made equally, which is not how budgeting is done in education at this moment. And among those who actually choose a side, they're more likely by 28% to 18% to say that the funding should be placed, a funding priority should be placed with early education rather than college education. So again, so these are sort of both points that that policymakers should have in the back of their heads moving forward, which is the public's looking for increases, not cuts, and they're looking for, at the very least, a little bit more equity between the earliest years of education in a child's life and the sort of last years of education in a young adult's life. Back on the political point on the next slide, we put forward to the idea, after we mentioned the various policies that people did tell us that they supported in large numbers, if their member of Congress were to support those kinds of policies, would it have an impression on them one way or the other? Would they be more favorable or less favorable toward that member of Congress? 57%, a pretty strong number actually, say that they would be more favorable toward their member of Congress, including 33% who say they would be much more favorable. You compare that to just 6% who say that they would have a more negative impression from their member of Congress due to that. Not shown here, but the balance 35% said that it really wouldn't make a difference to them either way. So there is absolute political upside here and really de minimis political downside, both as Congress is sort of members of Congress are looking and deciding whether to try and work with the Trump administration and whether to sort of support these policies just on their own in general. The benefits greatly outweigh the drawbacks. And if you look on our final slide, on the next slide, at some sort of key voter groups, key constituencies, there's pretty strong numbers here who say that they would be more favorable toward their member of Congress. Lower income parents, mothers in particular. Lori mentioned non-white voters, Hispanics. We see in the numbers among African Americans are also very strong. I don't have it in front of me. I believe it's closer to 77% among African Americans say they would feel more favorable. Seniors at 60%, ideological moderates at 60% also. And we could, in theory, add to this slide one more really key political group, which is self-identified independents, 57% of whom say they would be more favorable to their member of Congress. So at the end of the day, in reaching out to some of the key constituencies that tend to swing elections in our highly divided polity, we find that these groups really can be swayed to a certain degree by what they see as a highly important issue. The very last slide, truly the last slide, I promise, sort of lays out some of the points that Lori and I made as we went through. In a nutshell, that voters see a need for early education. They want to see it fully funded, and they want bipartisan cooperation here. They're unlike so many issues that Lori and I pull on. There's not a massive polarization within the electorate on this. These are some pretty one-sided numbers, and they all point to moving forward and cooperation rather than sort of being at each other's throats the way a lot of people feel Congress is. They support a number of specific policies and in this area, which I said is, as I said, is I think the most important finding we have here. And they want to see early learning as part of the equation. We do plenty of work around childcare versus pre-K and what's the difference between the two. And look, at the end of the day, in some ways it's a distinction without a difference as far as the public is concerned, because they believe so strongly in the idea that early childhood education should be education, period. Whether you call it childcare or call it pre-K, there needs to be an educational component as far as the public is concerned. And finally, there is a sense that voters will reward members who do the right thing on this issue. It's going to make them feel more favorable toward members of Congress, which, as I don't need to tell any of you, is something Congress pretty desperately needs at this point. if you flip to the last slide, all we have to say is thank you very much for listening, and I believe I am going to pass over to Charles to take questions from people listening.
That's great. So as Tony mentioned before, for folks who have questions, now is your opportunity to submit those through the questions pane on your webinar screen. So we will hold for just a few moments for folks to submit questions, and then we will do our best to get those answered. Our first question is about year after year results and how this year's results compare to this survey from previous years, which is a great question. And I can let Lori and Jay speak to that, but just broadly, support has not decreased from year to year. This is our fifth year of doing this national poll, and support for investments in quality early childhood education remain consistent. But I can let Lori or Jay speak to any other specifics about the support from year to year.
Sure, I'll just say I think we definitely broke some new ground this year. We tested a range of different policies that we've never tested before. Again, we saw strong majority support for all of those. The things that we did track from previous years, for example, were the things where we broke out early education a little bit, looked at different aspects of it, asked respondents to tell us how important they thought that was. And again, that was extraordinarily consistent. For example, we had 89% telling us that making early education and childcare more affordable for working families to give children a strong start was very or somewhat important. That's exactly the same number we saw in 2013, and within margin of error of the years in between there as well. So again, we saw, I'd say, I wouldn't frame it in the negative, I'd frame it in the positive, that this is an issue that American voters have not wavered on. They've consistently placed it as a high priority, even as different issues have sort of come in and out of vogue in terms of being talked about in Washington or being highlighted in the news. That early education has sort of been a sleeper issue. It's consistently, every single time we've tested it, been something that people said is important for our country and that they place as a high priority.
Thanks, Lori. Our next question is, what will we do with the poll results? And that's a great question. We use these poll findings year-round. We use them as part of a member education, as we're meeting with members of Congress, meeting with the administration to educate them on the importance of early childhood education. We make clear that there is significant voter support for this issue. We are also today going to be starting a pretty sizable promotion of these poll findings, so you'll see some great advertising of this to make sure that we're reaching as many people as possible inside the Beltway with these findings as we get into debates and battles on Capitol Hill in the coming weeks and months. This information will be incredibly helpful. And also, all of this content that you're seeing, this PowerPoint presentation, as well as fact sheets, shareable infographics for social media, all of that is available, as Chris mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, at ffys.org/2017-poll. And so all of what you're seeing today, including a recording of today's webinar, will be available online later today. Another question we had was, do we have examples of statewide advocacy groups using the poll data to influence state legislatures? And the answer is yes. In election years, we partner with various state organizations in states where states that are considered battleground states to not only test national voter sentiment, but also voter sentiment in these battleground states. But at the national level, advocacy groups nationwide are using this data to show local elected officials, state elected officials, that support for quality early childhood education is high nationwide. We have not done any state level testing this year, but as part of our polling next year, which will be a midterm election year, we will be going back into doing some state level testing as well. And we have time for one more question. As I mentioned, we will be posting this video of today's webinar online on our YouTube page and on our website, and we will gladly take any questions that we didn't have time to reach today. Lori, a question for you. Is it surprising to see such high support among Republican voters when often we don't see Republican action on Capitol Hill on this issue?
Well, I think I have the benefit of having been able to look at this data over the last 5 years. We've consistently seen Republican voters placing this as a high priority, telling us that this was important. You know, Republican voters love tax credits. And so, you know, I think it's no shock, therefore, that even things like tripling the child care tax credit, even increasing funding for programs like Head Start, people really respond to that. What we've heard in the past when we've held focus groups is that voters see this as proactive. They see it as a clear need in the survey. We saw again and again that's a clear need in their communities. And lots of voters tell us that it directly affects their own lives. So given all of that, no, I'm not surprised that Republican voters are responding this way because we've had 5 years of data telling us that Republicans really, that this is a unique issue that spans the partisan spectrum and that that all voters, irrespective of party, are telling us is important and something that they'd like to see more attention paid to in Washington.
If I could, this is Jay. If I could add to that, I think what is interesting and alluded to in the question is the difference between the leaders in Washington and the voters on the ground. And I think it's true in both parties, honestly. As Lori said, we're not surprised by the data among Republicans here because we've been seeing it for years. What's surprising is and dismaying is that Republican leadership in Congress doesn't seem to think that Republican voters do care about these issues and that they'd rather just sort of cut and only care about the deficit and not actually care about specific programs. And on the other side of the aisle, as I said, Democratic leaders in Congress seem to think that rank and file Democrats don't want to do anything that would benefit the Trump administration in any way, shape, or form. Well, that's not true. That's just not how Democratic voters are viewing issues like this. They're viewing them as a specific policy that, as Lori says, actually affects their lives. So that disconnect, that sort of persistent disconnect between elected leaders in Washington and actual voters does come through pretty consistently from year to year, and is, you know, always a little bit surprising that it doesn't change.
Great. Thanks so much, Jay and Lori. We are going to have to end the webinar now, but we certainly appreciate everyone who joined. We had incredibly high turnout, and we look forward to getting all of this data out to you over the coming days and weeks. Please let us know if you were not able to have your question answered today. Please feel free to share that with us, and we will do our best to get a response to you as quickly as possible. As I mentioned, all of this information is on our website at ffys.org, and we will be sharing everything on social media later today. So please, as you are posting on social media, feel free to share our content and get this information out to your networks. And thank you very much for joining us today. Have a great day.